So this weekend I spent a few hours painting 7 custom resin heads for my custom figures. And I have a collection here of a few of these blank heads that I've accumulated over the past few months, and I've just been putting it off. But I want to share with you how I ended up with the results I have on screen. In a few moments I'll show you what that looks like, and I wanted to share with you the technique for some of them. And I've picked up this technique over time. I'm still not very good at it, but I'll share with you what I've learned, and you can apply it to your technique building or just polish out what you're doing. In any case, let me show you what I ended up with. I had the first 5 set up and I finished 2 more later after the day was out, but in total I got 7. So here's the Superman and Batman head sculpts that I picked up off of eBay from Action Figure Customs out of Canada, and I've decided to paint these because these are the characters I wanted. So in any case, primer is going to be the first step, and I had to primer this one twice because I blew it. I really didn't know what I was doing, and I was learning, but it's always a good thing to jump into it and find out what the techniques are in case you haven't been taught how to do it. Teaching yourself is always fun. It's maybe frustrating, but it is definitely a learning a new technique is going to take time and lots of practice. So in this case, after primering the head, I went ahead and started adding the flesh tone that I wanted. And when working with any of these paints, you need to find out how they work, how they dry down, how they spread if you thin them out, etc. So in any case, these do dry down a little darker than what you see in the liquid form. For this practice, I ended up using craft paints that I bought at Michael's for like $1.50. And for practice, this turned out just fine. So this was not an actual final product. Now technically you're supposed to add a yellow coat or wash, a red wash, and a blue wash. And as you can see here, I've already done that earlier, but I didn't like the way it looked. You still see a little tinge of that blue in there. You can see my test spot on the actual spool, or the holder that I have the head on. And I just didn't like the way it turned out. So I ended up re-primering the head, and now here I am adding flesh tone back in. So this is now my 3rd coat. Just a word of caution, if you add too many coats, even with the airbrushing, you are very likely to start eliminating details. In the hair, it's not going to be an issue, but as far as facial details like wrinkles, eyebrows, etc., those can definitely disappear if you have your coats of paint or primer too thick. So I finally got it to where I liked it, and I decided that this is the tone I wanted to keep, and so I went ahead and covered the whole thing. Now, to advance in my technique learning, and I didn't want to really spend a lot of time on these, I wanted to add some shadowing. And the best thing for me to do was to use a second layer or second tone and come at an angle. So I tried coming from the back to produce a shadow and just use the relief, the texture to cause a relief. And it looked okay. And so then I decided to add that same tone coming from a different angle to see what it would produce like. And so I added some directly to the face, and that looks okay. I like the color. I can work with that, but I still wanted to have some drop shadows. So the best thing for me to do was to actually turn the head at a exaggerated angle, almost a 45-degree angle, well actually even more, and I started to add the shadows coming in from the bottom, and that actually helped out a lot. So I turned it down, and I have my paint really thinned out, so it's just, again, it's a wash, and it's just going to stain my layer of paint. So I came in from this angle here to cause a deeper shadow. It's okay, it looked all right. And I did it on the other side, obviously, because I wanted it to match. Obviously, I went too far on this one. I have to actually correct that. But in any case, I wanted to come from the bottom up, as you see here. And this turned out really cool. It created some shadows that I could really not achieve without the airbrush on doing this. Now here, I'm still practicing. It's not my best work here. I've repeated this over several times. And so once I got to the point that I needed, now it was time to work on details. By the way, this is how I ruined the first one that you were still looking at. When I said add a wash, this is not a wash. This is paint. Now you do want to add a yellow wash to the skin tone, but this is not it. And this is how I ruined this one. And I had to start over on this one again, just like the previous one. So I just wanted to show you what not to do. Now a wash is supposed to look like, in this next clip that I'll show you, it's going to be very, very thin. Almost transparent, because all you really want to do is stain the underlying color. In this case, it didn't just stain it, it painted it. And no matter what other color you put on here or what other wash, it's just not going to take to the color that you are desiring to have for flesh tone. So a wash looks specifically like this. It is a thin, translucent, or transparent color that allows the other to show through, and it's only going to stain that underlying paint. Now here, it doesn't matter what you do to it now. It's yellow. It's not going to change. It's just going to turn orange. But this is what you would want that yellow to be, this thin. This is what you want that blue to be. You want it to be this thin. And then you get the actual skin tone you're looking for. So the next clip will show you, coming back now to the Superman head, well, the other Superman head, the Kingdom Come Superman head sculpt, that this is what it looks like when it's done correctly. And this is after many trial and error of practice. I finally got it to look like this, and I'm really happy with it. Now the highlights that you see here, I had to come back in with a detail brush and add those in, and those furrowed brows and all those details in the actual face. I came back with a fine liner pen and added some more red to it. So it's just another wash of paint that's in there. Now, whenever you're painting the hair to these custom heads, it's always advisable to start with the edge of the hair. With a fine tip brush, line out all of the edges. That way when you come in with a large thick brush like this, all in black, you're not having to worry about getting to the edges. You only worry about the center. So we gave him a little toupee here. Now it's time to cover it up and get him going on his way. And the nice thing about this is you can come back and add a second or third layer without having to go into those edges, which makes your work nice and clean. So it is going to take some time for you to do this, to outline the head sculpt, depending on how intricate the hair is. Once it's dry, you can come back and clear coat it and then add another layer of paint. So we're going to move on to the next one because I have 5 of these to do, and actually I have a total of 7. So it took me a while to get this all set up. After finishing this, then I was able to add some more details to the rest of the portrait. So the spools that you see these head sculpts attached to, I made these myself. I didn't actually buy these pre-made. They're just 2 spools that I got at the hobby store from Michael's, and I attached 2 little mini figures. They're actually wooden people, and I just glued them to the top. So there's a round portion at the top on this one, and I actually turned it into a cone on some of the others depending on the fitting that was for that particular head sculpt. But this allows me to keep my hands away from the actual sculpt, so my fingers are not getting into the paint, and it allows me to turn it into specific angles. Now depending on the head sculpt, sometimes I can just push it down in and the pressure will hold it, and there are other times that I do have to use some hot glue to get the head to stay on. And because it's a resin head sculpt, the glue doesn't stick to it. It allows it to wedge itself in there, but you can very easily remove it off of the spool, and you can remove that glue from the center of the head sculpt itself. And then you can fill it in with putty or epoxy and then fit it to the figure that you are trying to match or attach it to. So as you can tell here, by having all of the edges painted in, I don't have to worry about going to the edges with the larger brush. And any overspill, etc., is just going to stay in that one area. So it makes it that much easier. Now with any of this, these magnifiers make it so much easier, especially for this detail. This kind of detail requires those magnifiers. If you got great eyesight, more power to you. Excellent. However, as you get older, that eyesight tends to disappear, and with glasses, it just makes it that much more difficult. So by using a ×5 magnifier, I'm able to get in close enough to see the detail and use a fine tip brush, and I added the gray in here a little at a time, just going over the black and letting some of it show through to make it as realistic as possible. So the nice thing about having this on a spool is that once you finish in one direction, so that you don't carry the paint over to an area you're not supposed to, in this case I don't want to paint the ear, I just want to paint the hair around the ear, then you can actually take that spool and you can actually flip it over so that you can work in the opposite direction. And because it's wedged into this spool, that head sculpt is not going to fall off, or if you've got it hot glued. So now by switching directions, I can avoid painting the areas that need to be in their standard color. So I'm just following the contour of the hair and adding a little bit of paint, because I'm going to come back in and add a different color of gray and then eventually white. So in the areas that I don't need to follow the contour of the hair, then when it's possible, I use what's left in paint on the brush and just dry brush the rest of it in, just to advance that much quicker. And the dry brushing works really, really well, especially if all you need to do is pick up detail and not have to bury that detail in paint. Here we just need to pick up the detail to give it a look of gray hair. So once you've got one side totally finished, take a look at the other side and find out where that starting point is going to be so that you can match it. And once again, use your magnifying glasses, get that same fine tip brush, and here's a trick. Always clean that brush even if it's the same color, because what's happening, or what happens I should say, is that acrylic paint tends to dry as you use it. Just with the environment, the air in the environment, you'll end up getting a clumpy brush with that acrylic paint on that tip. And then your fine lines aren't going to be fine lines anymore. They're just going to be broad, ugly, messy lines. So always have some water nearby. Clean that tip before you go back into your color, so that when you load it with fresh color, you have a nice, clean tip on that brush. And that will continue to give you those fine lines and getting close to the details that you otherwise cannot do if the brush has clumps of paint on the tip. Because no matter how small it is, those clumps of paint will thicken and widen the brush, and then you won't be able to create the details that you're after. So once again, following the contours of the hair, and once you get to the back, use the dry brushing technique as much as possible. If you want to switch brushes, great. But because it's so small, this brush is enough. And remember, it's not a race. So just do what you can with what paint is loaded on that brush. And if you need more, then just load it up again. Just remember, if you're dry brushing now, only pick up enough paint that it will leave the paint that's needed for dry brushing. If you overload it, you're going to end up painting the details in of all those crevices. You want the crevices to stand out by the relief work being painted with the dry brushing, showing the contrast of color as you see here. And that's just also going to depend on your liking and on your character. So take a look at your work, pull it at arm's length from you, take a look at how it looks in different lighting or in the light you're going to be displaying it. And that way you can find out if you are off center or you've got more gray to one side or the other. And you always want to continue working this way because you want to make sure that you don't have to repeat your process. Especially if you've taken the head sculpt this far with detail and color, it would be so frustrating to have to start over because you've done something wrong and you didn't realize it until you're at this point. So now, once again, using the spool to test the paint and make sure you rub off the excess off the paint, and you come in with that second gray tone and adding some gray highlights. And now with this same tip brush, you get into those little tiny details that you otherwise could not get in there. But once again, make sure that tip is clean when you reload it with paint. Don't just load it up and think that because it's a small brush, it's going to have a fine line. It's only going to be a fine line if the tip is clean. So once you've reviewed your work and you've taken a look and finalized all the little details that you want on it and it looks just how you need it to look, then it's time to let it dry and then come back and hit it with some Mr. Super Clear or Model Masters matte finish clear coat or the semi clear coat, depending on what you want to have as a final look. Personally, I like the matte look. The reason I like the matte is because I can use a pencil to find the center point for the pupils. Now, I use a pencil. Others use a permanent fine tip marker, the micro tip marker, and that works fine too. Now, the reason I like the pencil is because I can paint over that eyeball with the gray white and it will still show the pupil, and I can then come back in and paint the actual pupils. Now, if you prefer to have the felt tip marker or the permanent marker showing through very boldly, then that's fine too, especially if the eyes are going to be black. And at the same time, even if they're not going to be black, it'll give you a nice outline to fill in with color or to have as is, depending on what your character is going to be. But pre-marking the pupils is going to help you out to center the line of sight that the character is going to have. So you don't want your pupils going off to one side and that's going to not fit the expression. You want the expression to fit the look as well, or I should say the look to fit the expression. And then you can take in your same pencil and draw out the eyebrows. That way it gives you a line to follow if you're going to come back in and paint it. And yeah, you could take that fine tip marker, that permanent marker, and pen those in. It's nothing wrong with that. Personally, I like the paint because it just looks that much better painted. But if all you had to do was use a marker, it would still work. Nobody's really going to tell. You'd have to put it right in your face to find out what they did. As you can see here, the pencil itself looks really good even at this distance. It looks like actual fine hair that's in there, but because it's not paint, it does show a difference. So I'm going to put in those lines with an actual fine tip brush, and once again, it has to be clean and it has to be thinned out so that it goes on almost like ink. It's very time consuming because it takes time to practice and get that down right. So this is not the first one that I painted. I've ruined several others before getting to this point. Now with any of these tiny little details under the eyelid on the bottom make a big difference as well. A little bit of light pink or light flesh tone will make those pop. And right now I'm adding the light gray or the white gray paint to the eyes. I don't use white because it's too stark white. It's too attention getting. And when you don't, although you do want the attention in the eyes, you want the attention on the pupil, not the whites of the eyes. You don't want that to be the first thing that hits you when you look at the portrait. You want the pupil, the color in the pupil of the eyes. Now because these pupils are so small and such a small head sculpt, they dry pretty quick. So now that the color is dry on the eye whites, I paint in the color of the pupil, which is a blue. And then I go over that with an even darker blue for the center of the pupil. And then I will finish it off with a little white dot for a highlight. Now if there's any mistakes that I make here, I can go back in with some of that extra paint and brush in the bottom or the top if I overpainted. You don't want to have the eyes directly in center because respectively in portraits, part of the eye at the top is always hidden by the upper lid. So you always want to draw your pupils toward the top a little bit more. Now here, after adding the light blue in the eyes, I will go ahead and add a dark pupil to show a contrast and then give the eyes a little bit more life. But what really gives the eyes life is that white dot or reflection in the upper right corner or the left, whichever one you think your lighting direction should be. But it should be in that little area to give it that much more dynamic to the eyes. Now once you're done painting the eyes, then you can seal them with a Tamiya high gloss clear coat, and it just looks really dynamic. So I'm going to leave you with an ending clip of the finished product, 7 head sculpts that I finished this weekend for 1/12 scale figures. I hope you liked the video. Please comment, like, subscribe, and of course, don't forget to keep customizing.